For roughly 1,000 years, the people of medieval Europe lived without electricity, without refrigeration, without running water, and without any of the chemical compounds we now consider essential to daily life. They had no plastic wrap, no antibiotics, no central heating, no bleach. And yet, they managed. They cooked, cleaned, preserved food for months, kept their homes warm through winters that killed livestock in the fields, drove insects from their bedding, treated wounds, and maintained their households with a level of practical ingenuity that we have almost entirely forgotten. We tend to imagine the medieval home as a dark, filthy, hopeless place, a space endured rather than managed. The popular imagination often portrays it as a waiting room for death, its inhabitants too ignorant to do anything but suffer. But that image is a distortion. The medieval household was, in fact, a quiet engine of applied chemistry, thermal engineering, and biological science, and operated by people who understood their materials with an intimacy that no modern textbook can replicate. They did not have our vocabulary, but they had our problems. And their solutions, passed down across generations through oral tradition and hands-on repetition, were not only effective, many of them still work today. To understand why these techniques were so remarkably refined, we must first understand the medieval household itself. This was not a place of leisure. It was a production unit. Before the age of mass manufacturing, virtually everything a family consumed, bread, soap, candles, cloth, medicine, even building materials, had to be made, maintained, or sourced within walking distance of the front door. The household was factory, pharmacy, restaurant, and hospital rolled into one. Every member contributed. Failure to manage any single element, fire, food, pests, light, could mean genuine catastrophe. The average medieval home in the 12th or 13th century was a single-room structure, often shared with livestock during the coldest months. Floors were compacted earth. Walls were a lattice of woven wood, packed with a mixture of clay, straw, and animal dung. Roofs were thick layers of thatch, dried reeds or straw, bundled and layered to shed rain. A central hearth, vented through a hole in the roof, or, in later centuries, through a rudimentary chimney, provided the only source of heat, light, and cooking energy. There was no separation between kitchen and bedroom, between workspace and living space. Everything happened in one room, around one fire. This arrangement demanded an extraordinary level of practical knowledge. A medieval householder needed to know how to bank a fire so it survived until morning without burning the house down. They needed to know which herbs repelled which insects, which substances could seal a wound, which methods could keep meat edible for 6 months without refrigeration. They needed to understand the properties of ash, animal fat, urine, lime, honey, smoke, salt, and vinegar, not as abstract chemistry, but as daily tools of survival. And critically, they needed to know how to do all of this using only what the land and their animals provided. The sophistication of this knowledge has been systematically underestimated. We tend to project our own helplessness backward. Because we cannot imagine preserving food without a refrigerator, we assume medieval people could not do it either, but they could. And the techniques they developed were not primitive approximations. They were refined, tested, and iterated over centuries. Some of them predate the medieval period entirely, reaching back to Roman or even Neolithic practices. And others were innovations born from the specific pressures of medieval life, the Little Ice Age, the cycles of famine, the ever-present threat of disease in densely shared living spaces. What follows is not a catalog of curiosities. It is a window into a lost operating system, a complete domestic technology stack built from organic materials and hard-won knowledge, much of which modern science has since confirmed was not merely effective, but chemically, thermally, and biologically sound. The most fundamental challenge of the medieval home was the one that governed everything else: fire. Without fire, there was no warmth, no cooked food, no light after sunset, and no means to process the raw materials that every other household task depended on. Controlling fire was not simply useful, it was existential, and the techniques developed around it reveal a depth of thermal engineering that is, even by modern standards, quietly impressive. But fire was also dangerous. A thatched roof, dry timber walls, straw bedding, and an open flame in the center of the room. The combination was a permanent invitation to disaster. Medieval fire management was therefore a discipline of precision: how to keep the fire alive without letting it escape, how to extract maximum heat from minimal fuel, how to extend its utility into every corner of daily life. The solutions they found were elegant in their simplicity. The first and most essential technique was banking the fire. Every night, the household's last task was to bury the glowing embers under a thick layer of ash. The ash acted as a thermal insulator. It slowed the combustion process to a near standstill without extinguishing it entirely. By morning, a careful rake through the ash would reveal a core of still-living coals, ready to be coaxed back into flame with a handful of dry kindling. This was not a casual habit. It was a critical survival skill. Relighting a fire from scratch in the medieval period, without matches, without lighters, without any chemical accelerant, required a flint, a steel striker, and a piece of charred linen called char cloth, and the process could take 10 to 15 minutes of focused effort in ideal conditions. In wet or freezing weather, it could take much longer. Banking the fire meant the difference between a warm start to the day and a household that began every morning in crisis. For warmth during the night, heated stones served as the medieval equivalent of a hot water bottle. Large, flat stones were placed near the hearth in the evening, absorbing heat for several hours. Before bed, they were wrapped in cloth and tucked beneath the blankets. A properly heated stone could radiate warmth for 4 to 6 hours, enough to carry a person through the coldest part of the night. The technique worked because stone has a high specific heat capacity. It absorbs energy slowly and releases it slowly. Medieval people did not know the term. They knew the result. Light was an equally pressing problem. The cheapest and most widely used solution was the rushlight. A length of common rush, peeled to expose the soft pith, then drawn slowly through a reservoir of melted animal fat, typically tallow from beef or mutton. Once dried, the coated rush was clamped in a simple iron holder at an angle of roughly 45 degrees and lit at the upper end. A single rushlight burned for approximately 15 to 45 minutes, depending on its thickness, producing a dim but functional glow. The entire process, harvesting the rushes, rendering the fat, dipping, drying, cost nothing beyond labor. Tallow candles, by contrast, required molds and wicking, and beeswax candles were a luxury reserved for churches and the wealthy. Yet for the ordinary household, the rushlight was the standard unit of illumination for centuries. These three techniques, banking embers, heating stones, and making rushlights, formed the thermal and luminous foundation of every medieval home. They cost nothing, they required no specialized tools, and they worked reliably, night after night, winter after winter. If fire was the foundation of the medieval home, food preservation was its most urgent ongoing challenge. Without refrigeration, not every piece of meat, every catch of fish, every harvest of grain and vegetable had to be processed for storage within days, or it would rot. The techniques developed to solve this problem were not approximations. They were precise, effective, and in several cases, identical to methods still used in artisanal food production today. Salt was the cornerstone. Medieval households that could afford it. And salt was expensive, by sometimes worth more per weight than the meat it preserved. Use dry salting and brining to extend the life of pork, beef, and fish by months. The principle is straightforward. High concentrations of salt draw moisture out of tissue through osmosis, creating an environment too dry and chemically hostile for most bacteria to survive. A properly salted ham, packed in a barrel and stored in a cool cellar, could remain edible for an entire winter. In coastal regions, and where salt was cheaper and fish was abundant, salt cod became a dietary staple that could last a year or more. Smoking served a complementary purpose. Meat or fish was suspended above a slow, smoldering fire, typically fueled by hardwoods like oak, beech, or apple, and exposed to smoke for hours or even days. The smoke deposited a thin layer of chemical compounds, including formaldehyde and acetic acid, onto the surface of the food. These compounds are antimicrobial. They inhibit bacterial growth and slow oxidation. Combined with the drying effect of the heat, smoking could preserve food for weeks to months. The technique was so effective that smokehouses became a standard feature of medieval estates by the 11th century. Honey offered a different preservation pathway entirely. Medieval households used honey not only as a sweetener, but as a sealant and preservative for fruits, nuts, and even small cuts of meat. Honey is naturally antibacterial. Its low moisture content, high sugar concentration, and mildly acidic pH create conditions in which most pathogens simply cannot survive. Archaeologists have found sealed pots of honey in Egyptian tombs, still edible after 3,000 years. Medieval cooks did not need to know the chemistry. They knew that fruit submerged in honey would last through the winter, and that a wound dressed with honey healed faster and resisted infection. Yes, vinegar completed the preservation toolkit, produced by allowing wine, ale, or cider to undergo a second fermentation, acetic acid bacteria converting alcohol into acid. Vinegar was the all-purpose household chemical of the medieval world. It preserved vegetables through pickling. It cleaned surfaces. It was used as a rinse for wounds. Mixed with herbs, it was even believed to ward off plague. And while the bubonic plague was transmitted by fleas rather than airborne particles, vinegar's antimicrobial properties were real. The famous Four Thieves vinegar, a blend of vinegar steeped with garlic, rosemary, thyme, and lavender, was reportedly used by grave robbers during the Black Death to protect themselves from infection. Whether the story is apocryphal or not, the recipe itself is a genuine antiseptic. The medieval household's approach to cleaning reveals what is perhaps the most surprising overlap with modern chemistry. The primary cleaning agent was lye, a strongly alkaline solution produced by filtering water through wood ash. The process was simple and universal. Hardwood ash, preferably from oak or beech, was collected from the hearth and placed in a barrel or trough with a drainage hole at the bottom. Water was poured over the ash repeatedly, each pass leaching potassium carbonate and potassium hydroxide from the mineral residue. The resulting liquid, clear, slippery, and caustic, was lye. As mixed with rendered animal fat and boiled, it produced soap. The chemical reaction at work is saponification, the same process used in every bar of soap manufactured today. Medieval soap makers did not know the word. They did not need to. They had the recipe, and it worked. Urine served an equally important, and to modern sensibilities, startling role. Stale urine, which develops a high ammonia content as urea breaks down through bacterial action, was collected in household pots and used as a powerful degreasing agent. It was used to scour wool, to set dyes in fabric through a process called mordanting, and to clean stubborn stains from clothing and linen. The practice was so widespread that in medieval England, urine collection was an organized trade. Barrels of it were sold to fullers, the textile workers who cleaned and thickened woven cloth by trampling it in vats of urine-based solutions. The ammonia dissolved oils and grease with a chemical efficiency that plain water could not match. Inside the home, floors presented a unique challenge. In a single-room dwelling with compacted earth underfoot, animals nearby, and food preparation happening in the same space, keeping the floor clean was a constant battle. The medieval solution was strewing, scattering fresh-cut herbs and rushes across the floor surface. Meadowsweet, lavender, rosemary, chamomile, and mint were among the most commonly used. As they were walked upon, the herbs released their essential oils, volatile organic compounds that masked odors and, in several cases, actively repelled insects. Lavender contains linalool, a compound now commercially used as an insect repellent. Rosemary contains camphor and eucalyptol. Mint releases menthol. These were not aromatherapy. They were functional pest management, and in the lime washing, applying a slurry of slaked lime and water to interior walls served triple duty. It brightened dark rooms by creating a white, light-reflective surface. It sealed porous walls against moisture infiltration. And it was antimicrobial. Calcium hydroxide, the active compound in lime wash, has a pH above 12. At that alkalinity, most bacteria, mold spores, and fungi cannot survive. Medieval households lime washed their walls, their outbuildings, and their animal shelters regularly. Not because they understood pH scales, but because they observed that whitewashed spaces stayed cleaner and healthier. The practice persisted in rural Europe well into the 20th century. The battle against pests was relentless. Fleas, lice, bedbugs, flies, and mice were permanent residents of every medieval dwelling. Eliminating them entirely was impossible. Managing them was a daily discipline. Wormwood and tansy were the two most widely deployed botanical weapons. Both plants contain thujone, a compound toxic to insects and intestinal parasites. Dried bundles of wormwood were placed inside mattresses, hung from rafters, and tucked into clothing chests. Tansy was strewn on floors and packed around stored food. The effectiveness was genuine. Modern studies have confirmed that thujone disrupts the nervous systems of many common household insects. Fleabane, as its name directly suggests, was another standard addition. The plant's pyrethrin-like compounds made it a natural insecticide, and it was commonly burned as a fumigant, its smoke driving fleas and flies from enclosed spaces. For wounds and minor infections, the medieval household relied on a surprisingly effective pharmacopoeia. Honey, as noted, was a wound dressing of first resort. Cobwebs were another, collected and pressed into cuts to stem bleeding. This was not superstition. Spider silk contains vitamin K, which promotes clotting. Burr and the web's fine mesh acts as a natural bandage that traps platelets at the wound site. Medieval people did not understand the mechanism. They understood the outcome. Garlic was consumed in large quantities not merely for flavor, but as a prophylactic against illness. Allicin, the compound released when garlic is crushed, has broad-spectrum antibacterial and antifungal properties. Medieval herbalists prescribed garlic for everything from digestive complaints to respiratory infections, and while many of their prescriptions were ineffective or worse, this one was sound. Modern clinical research has consistently confirmed allicin's antimicrobial activity. Perhaps the most remarkable medical technique was the use of moldy bread as a wound poultice. Multiple medieval medical texts, including those from the Islamic Golden Age that circulated widely in European translation, describe the application of bread mold to infected wounds. The active agent in many bread molds is, of course, penicillin, the same compound that Alexander Fleming would not formally identify until 1928. Medieval practitioners had no concept of antibiotics, but they had observed over centuries of trial and error that certain molds reduced infection and promoted healing. The knowledge was empirical, not theoretical. It was no less real for that. The construction of the medieval home itself was an exercise in material efficiency that modern sustainable architects have begun to revisit with genuine respect. Wattle and daub, the woven wood and clay technique that formed the walls of most ordinary dwellings, was not a primitive compromise. It was an engineered composite. The wattle lattice provided tensile strength and structural flexibility. The daub, a mixture of clay, straw, animal dung, and sometimes animal hair, and provided thermal mass and insulation. A properly built wattle and daub wall could maintain interior temperatures significantly warmer than the exterior in winter and cooler in summer, the same principle that governs modern earth-sheltered construction. Thatch roofing was similarly underestimated. A thick thatch roof, 12 to 15 inches deep when properly laid, trapped a substantial layer of still air between its fibers. And still air is one of the most effective thermal insulators available. A well-thatched medieval cottage could retain heat with surprising efficiency, and the material itself was entirely renewable, harvested from the same fields that provided grain. The drawback was fire risk, and medieval communities enforced strict regulations about chimney construction and fire management precisely because they understood how quickly a thatch roof could ignite. The compacted earth floors were treated with a solution that sounds improbable but was chemically effective: ox blood. Mixed with the clay and tamped down, the proteins in the blood acted as a binding agent as they dried, creating a hard, smooth, semi-waterproof surface that resisted wear and could be swept clean. The technique has been verified in modern tests. Blood proteins polymerize as they dry, forming a durable matrix within the clay structure. In some regions, the blood was mixed with lime for additional hardness. Egg whites served as the household's all-purpose adhesive and sealant. They were used to bind pigments for painting, to clarify wine and ale by trapping suspended particles as the albumin coagulated, and to seal cracks in pottery. The medieval householder wasted nothing. Stale bread became trenchers, edible plates that absorbed the juices of whatever was served upon them, then were eaten themselves or given to the poor. Old bones were boiled for broth, then dried and ground for fertilizer. Fat was rendered for candles, soap, and waterproofing. Ash was saved for lye. Even the soot scraped from chimney interiors found use as a pigment and, mixed with grease, as a crude ink. What is striking about these techniques taken together is not their quaintness, but their coherence. The medieval household operated as a closed loop, a system in which virtually every byproduct of one process became the input for another. Ash from the fire made soap, fat from the kitchen made candles, urine from the chamber pot cleaned the cloth, bones from the meal fed the soil, stale bread became the plate. There was an economy of materials so complete that it would take the modern sustainability movement 700 years to begin articulating the same principle under the name circular economy. We lost this knowledge not because it stopped working, but because it stopped being necessary. Or so we believed. The Industrial Revolution replaced the household self-sufficiency with mass production. Soap came from factories. Light came from gas mains and then electric grids. Food preservation was outsourced to canning, refrigeration, and chemical additives. The skills that had sustained European domestic life for a millennium were rendered redundant in the space of 2 generations. Grandmothers who knew how to make soap from ash and fat watched their grandchildren buy it wrapped in paper from a shop. The chain of transmission broke. The knowledge did not vanish because it was disproven. It vanished because it was replaced. But replacement is not the same as improvement in every dimension. The medieval household produced almost no waste. It required almost no external inputs beyond what the land provided. It was, in the precise modern sense, sustainable, not by ideology, but by necessity. The industrial household that replaced it was more comfortable, more convenient, and more productive. It was also more dependent, more wasteful, and more fragile. When the supply chain fails, and supply chains do fail, the modern household is helpless in ways the medieval household never was. This is not nostalgia. It is not a call to abandon modern convenience and return to banking fires and dipping rushlights. It is an observation that the distance between our ancestors and ourselves is shorter than we assume. They solved the same problems we solve. They managed heat, light, food, sanitation, and shelter with materials we still have access to, using principles that modern chemistry has since confirmed were sound. We did not replace medieval knowledge with something better in every case. In some cases, we simply forgot. The next time you reach for a light switch, consider that for 1,000 years, the last task of the night was to bury a fire in its own ash. A small, deliberate act of faith that warmth would survive until morning. Every one of those techniques was a conversation between a person and their materials, refined by centuries of hands reaching into the same ash, the same fat, the same earth. The knowledge is still there, sleeping under the surface, waiting to be useful again.